Part 1.
You are going to hear a radio program about sport.
First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4.
And now for our Mystery Personality of the Week and your chance to win one of our fabulous prizes. Last week's competition generated a huge response, and the first 5 answers pulled out of the bag will receive £100 worth of sports clothes vouchers. And if you didn't win last week, here's another chance. And this week's prize is even bigger. We're giving away 10 prizes of £250 worth of book, music and clothes vouchers to mark the first anniversary of the show on the air. So get your pens ready to take down the address details. Just write the name of the person you think is our mystery personality and send it to Mystery Draw at the address Marcia will give you in just a second. The address will be repeated at the end of the show for those of you who didn't get it. And so it's over to Marcia, who will tell you a few tantalising details about our mystery person this week.
Thanks, Mike. Well, here goes. Our mystery person this week is a very well-known footballer who plays for a famous club and has also played for his national team. He is very talented and is enormously popular, especially for the part he played in a famous footballing victory. And 2 clues. He hasn't got a famous wife, and he speaks French. If you think you know who it is, then pop the answer on a postcard and send it to Mystery Draw, P.O. Box 5110, London SE1 5LE. That's P.O. Box 5110. And please don't forget to write your name and address too. And now it's back to Mike.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
Thank you, Marcia. Get those postcards in and make this a bumper anniversary draw. Now, if you remember, last week on the show, we talked to the organiser of a new group set up to help young people up to the age of 20 to get involved in activities like horse riding, tennis, scuba diving, cycling, or any form of sport which involves some kind of expense. John Tebbit, the organiser, rang us to say that the response to his appeal on the show was staggering. A large number of people, both young and old, have offered their services free as volunteers. The whole thing has been overwhelming. John said that they had also had numerous offers of help throughout the country to use facilities free of charge. As if that was not enough, they've received many donations, including several rather large gifts of more than £5,000. On behalf of John Tebbit, and also of those who will benefit from the generous gifts to the Trust, I would like to say thank you. This week, we're going to talk to a very unusual athlete indeed. Patrick, who is 20 years of age, has been wheelchair-bound for the past 5 years after a motorcycle accident left him paralysed from the waist down. This has not stopped this young man from getting out and about. He's an inspiration to all of us. Patrick has excelled in archery, beating the best in the field, so much so that he has won sponsorship from leading sports manufacturers, which has now enabled him to devote more time to perfecting his skills. So I would like to introduce you to Patrick, who is going to tell us what this sponsorship means to him.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear two university students, Phil and Stella, talking to their tutor about their research project.
You have some time to look at questions 11 to 17. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 17.
Come in. Ah, yes, Stella. Is Phil there too? Good. Come on in. OK, so you're here to discuss your research project. Have you decided what to focus on? You were thinking of something about the causes of mood changes, weren't you?
Yes, but the last time we saw you, you suggested we narrowed it down to either the effects of weather or urban environment. So we've decided to focus on the effects of weather.
Right, that's more manageable. So, your goal is, Phil?
To prove the hypothesis, no, to investigate the hypothesis that the weather has an effect on a person's mood.
Good. And what's your thesis, Stella?
Well, our thesis is that in general, when the weather's good, it has a positive effect on a person's mood, and bad weather has a negative effect.
Can you define your terms here? For example, what do you mean by good and bad?
OK, well, good would be sunny, warm weather, and bad would be when it's cold and cloudy or raining.
And how would you define an effect on a person's mood? What would you be looking to find?
An effect on the way a person feels.
A change in the way they feel, like from feeling happy and optimistic to sad and depressed.
Right. And what sort of weather variables will you be looking at?
Oh, sunshine, temperature, cloudiness, precipitation, among others. It'll depend a bit what the weather's like when we do the survey.
Fine. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first, what about background reading? I gave you some suggestions. Did you manage to read any of it?
Yes, we read the Ross Vickers article, the one comparing the groups of American Marines training in summer and winter. That's quite relevant to our study. It was interesting because the Marines who were training in the cold winter conditions tried to cheer themselves up by thinking of warm places, but it didn't really work.
Yes, they were trying to force themselves to have a positive mental outlook, but in fact it had the opposite effect, and they ended up in a very negative state of mind.
And we found some more research by someone who wasn't on the reading list you gave us, George Whiteborn. He compared people living in 3 countries with very different climatic conditions. Actually, he looked at several things, not just the weather. But he found some people's reactions to bad weather were much worse than others, and it was linked to how stressed they were generally. The weather on its own didn't have such a significant effect on mood.
And we looked at a paper by
Haverton.
Yeah, he broke weather up into about 15 or 16 categories and did qualitative and quantitative research. He found that humans respond to conditions in the weather with immediate responses, such as fear or amazement. But these responses can also be linked to associations from their earlier life, such as a particular happy or sad event.
Did you have a look at Stanfield's work?
Yes. It was interesting because the type of questions he asked was similar to what we were planning to use in our survey.
Yes.
He asked people how they were feeling on days with good and bad weather. He found the biggest factor seemed to be the humidity. Moods were most negative on days with a lot of rainfall. Long periods without sunshine had some effect, but nothing like as much.
That could be quite a useful model for your project.
Yes, we thought so too. Although we can't continue our survey for as long as he did. He did his over a 6-month period.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 18 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 18 to 20.
Right, well, you've made quite a good start. So, where are you going from here?
Well, we've already made the questionnaire we're going to use for the survey. It's quite short, just 8 questions. We're aiming to survey 20 people over a period of 3 months from October to December.
We can't specify the actual dates yet because it depends on the weather. We want to do the survey on days with a range of different weather conditions. And we'll just be working on campus, so our data will only be statistically sound for the student population here.
That's okay. Have you thought how you'll determine what will constitute each aspect of weather, and how many you're looking at?
We decided on 4. The amount of sunshine, cloudiness, temperature and precipitation. We thought we might use the internet to get data on weather conditions on the days we do the survey, but we haven't found the information we need, so we might have to measure it ourselves. We'll see.
Then we've got to analyse the results, and we'll do that using a spreadsheet, giving numeric values to answers. And then, of course, we have to present our findings to the class, and we want to make it quite an interactive session. We want to involve the class in some way in the presentation, maybe by trying to create different climatic conditions in the classroom, but we're still thinking about it.
I see. Well, that sounds as if you're on the right lines. Now, what I'd suggest that you think about...
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
Part 3. You will hear an interview with Dr. Simons.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Well, as I said, there were 3 areas of interest, so perhaps we should take each in turn.
Fine. Let's take the medical and physical evidence first.
Well, first of all, life expectancy. Although some very old individuals were encountered, the Ramesses is a case in point. He was probably over 90. It seemed the average Egyptian died rather young, from about 30 to 35 years old, on the whole. Although the nobility, as might be expected, tended to live longer. Some of them have been found to be 50 or 60 years old. Well, naturally, the older they got, the more medical problems were encountered. But some modern disorders have so far not been found. There is no evidence yet of any malignant tumours, for example, although the fact that most people studied were comparatively young could account for this. Another modern problem, dental decay, was also absent, probably due to the plain diet and absence of sugar. There was another problem with teeth caused by this diet. The stones on which their flour was ground caused a lot of grit to get into the bread, and this eroded the teeth, so much that many older people must have suffered greatly and could have been confined to a liquid diet. An abscess on the jaw caused by this kind of erosion may in fact have contributed to the death of Ramesses II. Analysis of the internal organs of several mummies has revealed that intestinal parasites were common, even among the upper classes. Evidence of a generally low standard of public hygiene and another widespread disorder was a form of anemia. Naturally, the ancient Egyptians didn't smoke, but lesions on the lung were widespread. These, however, are the sort that we associate today with workers in mines and quarries, and must be due, in the case of Egyptians, to living in sandy desert conditions. Actually, on the smoking issue, there was a temporary sensation when traces of what appeared to be tobacco were found in Ramesses' sarcophagus, but botanists later confirmed that it was not in fact tobacco itself, but a related plant which is native to Egypt. In the meantime, cynics were commenting that it probably had come from the cigarette of some careless Egyptologist or museum attendant of the past.
Ha ha! And what about their physical appearance?
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Well, what would you expect from seeing Egyptian art? They were light and slight in build. The average height for both men and women was about 1.60 meters, and studies of the skeletons from which the covering of flesh can be extrapolated suggest that they weighed much less in relation to their height than most modern people. From about 10 to 15 kilograms, less than someone of a similar height today is the estimate.
And what about mummification?
Well, the first thing to be said is that it wasn't always done in the same way, and it was by no means infallible, as many people tend to think. Many bodies, including that of the famous King Tutankhamun, were also entirely destroyed by overuse of one or another of the substances generally employed. The basic procedure was much the same, however. Most of the internal organs, including the brain, were removed and preserved separately in a jar. The brain was got out through the nose using a sort of hook.
Oh dear.
Yes, it used to be thought that the heart was always removed too, but in the case of Ramesses it was found in place. The body was then immersed in a substance called natron. That's a form of sodium carbonate, which occurred naturally in Egypt, for 40 to 70 days. It was then washed, made up and wrapped in linen bandages and placed in its coffin or sarcophagus. Then it was soaked in oils, resins and perfumes to help preserve it further.
You said the body was made up. Do you mean its face was painted?
Yes. Ramesses was not only made up, they had to restructure his nose, which was damaged when they took out his brain. The investigators found that it had been stuffed with small animal bones and peppercorns of all things. His hair had been dyed too.
You said that Ramesses had suffered other adventures after his death?
Ah, well, yes. Poor chap. Well, for a start, he was found in a much later tomb than his real date. Along with a lot of other pharaohs, it looks very much as if the priests of later times had moved and reburied him to save him from tomb robbers. His body was transported, along with the other pharaohs found in the same tomb, to the Cairo Museum. That was in 1871. and it was put on display. Well, naturally, removed from the dry desert atmosphere, his body started to deteriorate, and by the 1970s was in very poor state. That was part of the reason why the Egyptian authorities gave their consent for its temporary removal to Paris for study, yet another upheaval. The French experts aimed not only to carry out an investigation, but were also able to apply the latest techniques of restoration and conservation, so that at the end of the study, Ramesses was specially treated and then rewrapped in new bandages. Well, they weren't exactly new, since they were of ancient Egyptian date, given a new sarcophagus and carefully transported back to Cairo, where he is now kept in a controlled environment, which should slow down the deterioration process.
So, as I said at the beginning, not only was science served, but a proper respect was paid to the remains in the end.
Exactly.
The end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
You will hear someone talking about art. Look at questions 31 to 40.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first in this year's series of public lectures offered by the Art Gallery. As Chief Curator of the Gallery, I was given the honour of presenting the first lecture, and let me tell you, I had a difficult time deciding what to talk about tonight. Being the curator, I naturally know just about everything that's in this gallery, but I wanted to choose an artist who has a wide appeal. That seems only fair, yes? But I didn't want to talk about someone so well known that anything I said would be familiar. I wanted someone modern. My personal preference is for modern art. But again, I wanted to choose someone who had the potential to appeal to all art lovers, whether they're attracted to traditional forms, impressionism, surrealism, or what have you. So, having spent the last 5 years as a visiting professor in Barcelona, it's not surprising that I finally chose to talk about one of the greatest Catalan artists, one whose work is likely to be familiar to many of you, Joan Miró. Look at this. And this. And this. Ring any bells? Miró's most famous and most widely reproduced works tend to be like this: bright primary colours with lots of asymmetrical forms. He painted on large canvases, larger than himself quite often, and his paintings depicted birds, trees, flowers, and other features of the natural world. But Miró produced a great variety of work, and it's about some of his lesser-known paintings that I would like to speak this evening. Miró was born in Barcelona in 1893, the son of a goldsmith. He began to show talent very early, and in 1926 went to Paris, where he was drawn to the surrealists of Montparnasse. He did not define himself as a surrealist, however. He preferred to stay free to experiment with other artistic styles as he wished. Miró had an intense dislike of much of the painting and many of the painters he knew. He wished to do something totally different, to express his contempt for bourgeois art. And yet, ironically, Miraut's success has made his works much in demand among art collectors of the world. But we can't really talk about the artist without looking at his art. And that's what I'd like to do now. To take a look at just a few of Miraut's works and think about what it is that makes them special. Special to me, and to a great number of people who flock every day to the Miraut Foundation in Barcelona. Let's start with this. One of Miraut's best-known and brightest works, Woman and Bird. A sculpture created in 1982. It is on display in a park in Barcelona, often known as the Juan Miró Park. A huge sculpture, towering up into the sky. It reflects Miraut's eternal interest in these themes, as well as his more technical interest in materials. This sculpture is covered in mosaic, which gives it a naive and cheerful appearance. It is interesting that this sculpture was completed in 1982, just a year before Miraut's death. I think it shows that, towards the end, he was feeling as playful as a young man, and I think he wanted to share this playfulness in a park on such a big, very public scale. And now, another representation of a woman, this time just called Woman. This was painted in 1976, a late work for Miraut, and is a work we often see reproduced or on sale as postcards or posters in gallery shops around the world. So why is it so popular? I think the use of colour has something to do with it. People respond to these rounded shapes filled with primary colours, especially on a large canvas like this. Also, the fact that, while it is rather surreal, it is still possible to recognise the form of a woman and to see it as a sympathetic representation. It's a bold, bright painting, and I think that it awakens a reaction in many of us. And finally, something quite different, though still a woman. A harsh, even violent work that was completed in 1939, at a time when Miraut was greatly influenced by events of the Civil War in Spain. It's titled Seated Woman 2, but it can be hard to find the woman here, as she's been transformed into a rather horrendous creature. So is that how Miraut viewed women? As grotesque? Not at all. This picture can also be seen as strong, with a huge base and solid shoulders to support those who depend on her. In this painting, her arms and neck seem to grow as vegetation out of her shoulders, representing woman as a fertile ground, perhaps. We also see here the fish and birds, the moon and stars, so typical of Miraut's work, making her a creature of nature and of the heavens as well. And that's all we have time for this evening, I'm afraid. I hope that you've enjoyed this brief look at Miraut's work, and that you will enjoy the other lectures that follow this one. Thank you, and good night.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.